For centuries, the Habsburgs ruled Europe like no other family, stretching their influence across empires, kingdoms, and crowns. But behind their grandeur lay an obsession that would ultimately undo them. They were consumed by the belief that their bloodline had to remain pure, untouched by outsiders. And in that obsession, they sowed the seeds of their own extinction. The Habsburg dynasty began in the 11th century in what is now Switzerland. A relatively minor noble family at first, they grew ambitious, acquiring lands, titles, and marriages that expanded their influence across Europe. By the 15th century, they had become one of the continent's most powerful dynasties, producing emperors, kings, and archdukes in Austria, Spain, and the Low Countries. Their rise was as strategic as it was relentless, often summarized in the family motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." Marriage was the weapon of choice, a tool to consolidate power, gain territory, and bind alliances. But the Habsburgs took it one step further. In their pursuit of dynastic purity, they increasingly married within the family. Cousins, uncles, and nieces were paired in arranged marriages to keep wealth, titles, and power strictly inside the dynasty. At first, it seemed harmless, a way to reinforce loyalty and maintain the family's dominance. Over time, however, the consequences of generations of inbreeding began to appear. One of the earliest warning signs was the notorious case of Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. His parents were uncle and niece, a marriage that was the product of decades of repeated close-kin unions. From birth, Charles suffered severe health problems. He was physically weak, unable to walk or chew properly until late childhood, and his mental faculties were severely impaired. Physicians of the time described him as frail and often ill. Charles II became the last Habsburg king of Spain, dying childless and leaving a European throne crisis that would ignite the War of Spanish Succession. His condition was not a random misfortune, but the predictable result of relentless inbreeding over generations. Earlier, even in the 16th century, the dynasty already displayed troubling signs. Ferdinand I and Maximilian II, two key figures in the Austrian line, often married cousins and second cousins. Some children were healthy, some less so, but patterns began to emerge. Distinctive Habsburg jawlines, narrow faces, and other hereditary deformities that marked the family visually and medically. These were not merely cosmetic issues. The concentration of genes within a small pool increased the risk of recessive disorders, infertility, and early deaths. This obsession with family blood purity became almost an ideology. The Habsburgs were convinced that their unique heritage was divine, that outsiders could dilute their power and sanctity. They believed in a sacred bloodline that had to be protected at all costs, even if that cost was the health of their children. And as the centuries progressed, this relentless focus on intra-family marriage slowly eroded the dynasty's vitality. By the time the 17th century arrived, the consequences were stark. Physical deformities, mental instability, and reproductive failures became increasingly common among Habsburg heirs. Yet the pattern persisted, driven by politics, tradition, and pride. Each generation married strategically, often ignoring the mounting evidence that their practices were harming the very dynasty they sought to preserve. The Habsburg obsession with their own bloodline was a double-edged sword. It secured alliances and territorial control across Europe, creating one of the most powerful families the world had ever seen. Yet it carried within it the seeds of decline, a slow, almost imperceptible weakening of the family's genetic resilience. Within a few generations, the dynasty that seemed invincible would face the consequences of centuries of calculated inbreeding. If stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe as there's a lot more coming. Now back to the video. By the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with internal marriage had reached its peak. For generations, cousins, uncles, and nieces had been wed in carefully arranged unions, all in the name of preserving the so-called purity of the royal bloodline. At first, the effects were subtle, mostly visible in the famous Habsburg jaw, a pronounced lower jaw and elongated chin, a trait that became a family signature. But by the mid-1600s, the consequences became impossible to ignore. The most notorious case and the ultimate inbreeding champion was, of course, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, uncle and niece, Charles was the product of decades of repeated close-kin marriages. From birth he was weak, sickly, and intellectually impaired. He could not walk or speak properly for years, suffered from digestive and respiratory issues, and was incapable of fathering children. Chronic illness and physical deformity plagued him throughout his life. His very existence embodied the tragic cost of the Habsburgs' obsession with dynastic purity. Charles II's family history reads like a warning sign etched in generations of genetics. His parents were themselves products of cousin marriages. His ancestors married within the family so consistently that over 10 generations, the genetic diversity of the Spanish Habsburgs had become alarmingly narrow. Modern historians estimate that the coefficient of inbreeding for Charles II was roughly 0.25, equivalent to the offspring of a parent-sibling pairing. The result was a man whose body and mind were slowly, visibly failing under the weight of inherited defects. But Charles II was not an isolated case. Across Europe, the Habsburgs displayed an unsettling pattern of hereditary maladies. Physical deformities were common. The prominent jawline, drooping lips, misaligned teeth, and other skeletal abnormalities became defining traits. Beyond aesthetics, the family suffered from infertility, epilepsy, mental instability, and early death. Some branches of the family saw entire lines die out because heirs were incapable of producing offspring. The irony was bitter. In attempting to safeguard their power, the Habsburgs were undermining it at its root. In Austria, the dynasty faced similar issues. Emperor Leopold I, who ruled from 1658 to 1705, married Margaret Theresa of Spain, his niece. Their children displayed a variety of health problems, though a few survived into adulthood. Still, the hereditary strains were becoming increasingly evident. Weak constitutions, shortened lifespans, and recurring diseases. In Spain, the pattern was even more devastating. The relentless intermarriage within the Spanish Habsburg line had produced generations of frail heirs, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of the dynasty's control over the Iberian Peninsula. The Habsburg jaw, long ridiculed in caricatures, was more than a cosmetic flaw. It signified a deeper genetic fragility. Prominent historians and medical researchers now link it to mandibular prognathism, often accompanied by malocclusion and feeding difficulties, problems that plagued infants and weakened their development. But these physical traits were only the beginning. Charles II's inability to reproduce had far-reaching consequences. When he died childless in 1700, it sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that engulfed Europe and reshaped the continent's political landscape. The war was, in a sense, the Habsburgs' tragic inheritance, a crisis born not of politics but of genetics. Yet even as these consequences became apparent, the dynasty could not, or would not, change course. Marriages remained strictly internal. Pride, tradition, and political strategy outweighed biological warning signs. Families rationalized their decisions, alliances within the family maintained loyalty, wealth stayed consolidated, and the appearance of strength persisted. It was a calculated risk, one that for a time seemed to pay off. Habsburg rulers dominated vast territories, their power unmatched in Europe. But beneath the surface, the foundation was crumbling. By the late 17th century, inbreeding had become a chronic problem across both the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg lines. Royal medical records, correspondence, and accounts of court physicians paint a grim picture: fragile children, miscarriages, and frequent deaths. Even surviving heirs were often unfit to rule effectively. The Spanish Habsburgs, in particular, suffered from a concentration of hereditary disorders that left the dynasty incapable of continuing naturally. Every marriage intended to preserve power only tightened the genetic bottleneck, reducing fertility and amplifying defects. The lesson of the Habsburgs is stark. Their downfall was not the result of war, rebellion, or political mismanagement alone. It was written in their DNA. A family that had once wielded immense power became, over generations, trapped by its own obsession with purity. In the pursuit of perfection, they produced weakness. In the effort to control their destiny, they lost it entirely. By the time Charles II died, the Habsburg Empire was facing one of history's most dramatic transitions. The dynasty that had once seemed eternal had been brought low, not by enemies, but by itself. Inbreeding had hollowed out the family's future, leaving a void where ambition, pride, and strategic marriage had once guaranteed dominance. What remained was a cautionary tale, a biological and political tragedy intertwined, the story of a family that inbred itself into extinction. After the Spanish Habsburgs disappeared from the throne, the Austrian line remained the dynasty's final bastion. But even here, the consequences of centuries of inbreeding were clear. Unlike Spain, Austria still held considerable territory, ruling over a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and ethnic groups. Yet the internal strength of the family was no longer guaranteed by sheer ambition or political skill. It was increasingly undermined by fragile health, recurring genetic problems, and the occasional incapacity of heirs. One of the most telling examples comes from Emperor Leopold II, who ruled in the late 18th century. Though outwardly capable, he carried the cumulative genetic vulnerabilities of generations of intermarriage. His children, like many Habsburg heirs, displayed varying degrees of physical and cognitive difficulties. Fertility was never entirely reliable, infant mortality remained high, and the risk of inherited illnesses persisted. Even marriages with non-Habsburg partners, intended to strengthen alliances and introduce new blood, often came too late to counteract centuries of concentrated heredity. By the 19th century, the Habsburgs' internal fragility became more than a private concern. It had political consequences. Leaders were occasionally ill or weak. Succession was precarious, and the dynasty could no longer rely solely on dynastic continuity to maintain power. The sprawling empire they governed required competent rulers, yet some heirs were unable to meet the demands of leadership. Governance increasingly depended on advisors, ministers, and bureaucratic systems, highlighting that personal ability alone could no longer guarantee Habsburg supremacy. Medical historians examining portraits, letters, and court records have noted that the Austrian Habsburgs retained many of the same hereditary traits that plagued their Spanish cousins: elongated jaws, narrow foreheads, malocclusion, and in some cases limited mobility. Even into the 19th century, physicians warned that continued internal marriages could perpetuate or worsen these problems. Yet tradition and politics prevailed. The dynasty continued to prioritize alliances with other European royal families, often selecting partners based on social and political considerations rather than genetic health. The decline of the Habsburgs was not only biological but also structural. The rise of nationalism and revolutionary movements across Europe challenged the legitimacy of dynastic rule. A weakened family line compounded the difficulty of responding effectively to these crises. Emperors and archdukes were sometimes forced to abdicate or defer authority to ministers because the next generation was ill-prepared, either physically or politically, to lead. By the time Emperor Franz Joseph I took the throne in the mid-19th century, the dynasty had endured more than 6 centuries of Habsburg rule. Yet his reign, while long and outwardly stable, masked the vulnerabilities inherited from the past. Despite reforms, wars, and attempts to modernize the empire, the personal health of the family remained a concern. Franz Joseph's own children carried genetic risks, though by then the family had begun marrying more selectively outside the core Habsburg circle, a late attempt to counteract centuries of inbreeding. The story of the Habsburgs offers a rare historical insight: how a dynasty can rise to extraordinary power, yet gradually undermine its own foundation through obsession with blood purity. Their decline was not dramatic in the sense of a single catastrophic event. No single battle or rebellion ended their rule, but insidious and cumulative. Weak heirs, fragile constitutions, and the inability to adapt quickly to political and social change slowly eroded what had once been a virtually unassailable empire. Ultimately, the Habsburg legacy is paradoxical. They were brilliant strategists, masterful diplomats, and architects of one of Europe's longest-lasting dynasties. Yet their very methods, repeated internal marriages, insistence on dynastic purity, and prioritization of tradition over adaptability, sowed the seeds of fragility. The dynasty that once commanded armies, forged empires, and dominated the political landscape became, over centuries, increasingly vulnerable to the very forces it once controlled. The Habsburg story serves as both a historical and biological cautionary tale. It reminds us that power, wealth, and strategy cannot entirely overcome the realities of human biology. The pursuit of purity, whether political or genetic, carries consequences that may not be immediately visible, but can determine the fate of generations. And so, the Habsburgs' enduring lesson is clear: ambition without humility, and control without respect for natural limits, can turn even the mightiest dynasty into a fragile relic of its former glory.